This week in economics from WBRN Radio and on the Bostonred Network. The date of this episode, the 3rd of August, 2019. From WBRN Radio and on the Bostonred Network. In addition, we are on Twitter, YouTube, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Streaker, where we are headquartered, and various other outlets in between, including Facebook. This program we partner with Cranston Analytics, which we've been doing now for over 10 years, which used to be at one time, we used a Latin verb there, Cranston Econometrics. Anyway, so we are here. The Fed has cut the interest rate 25 basis points. We'll talk about that with the aid of the Washington Post and also Reuters, and we'll look at Brexit, where Brexit is, and some comments from Dr. Carney, the chair of the British Central Bank. And we'll also look at trade here, and we'll start out with the employment situation, July 2019. And incidentally, in our historic look, we'll go back to the Reagan administration and the attempts there to devaluate the dollar. Paul Volcker, where Paul Volcker played into that. That is credited with calming inflation, but you have to understand, a much smaller economy at that particular time, and where the present administration's so-called trade war plays in. And we'll make our arguments there, because you have more than just a so-called trade war. You have a decline in the global economy. Nonetheless, we'll go to the employment situation. Date is August the 2nd, 2019. Employment rose at 164,000 in July, and the unemployment rate is still setting at 3.7%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Notable job growth occurred in professional technical services, healthcare again, and social assistance and financial activities. This release presents statistics from 2 monthly surveys. The household survey measured labor force status, including unemployment by demographic characteristics. The establishment survey measures employment hours and earnings by industry. There. So we'll start with the household survey. The unemployment rate, of course, at 3.7%, was a little changed at 6.1 million. Major work groups there for Asians at 2.3%. In July, the jobless rate for adult men, 3.4%, adult women the same. Teenagers at 12.8%, for Europeans 3.3%, for African Americans at 6%, for Latinos at 4.5%, showed little or no change. The number of persons unemployed less than 5 weeks increased by 240,000 to 2.2 million, while the number of long-term, those jobless 27 weeks are half a year, declined by 248,000 to 1.2 million. Long-term unemployed accounted for 19.2% of the unemployed. In July, the labor force participation rate was 63%. The employment population ratio was at 60.7. Both were little changed over the month and over the year. Number of persons employed part-time for economic reasons declined by 363,000 in July to 4 million. Those individuals would have preferred full-time employment and, of course, working part-time because their hours had been reduced. Over the past 12 months, the number of involuntary part-time workers has declined by 604,000. In July, 1.5 million people were marginally attached to the labor force, essentially unchanged from a year earlier. Individuals were not in the labor force and wanted or were available for work in the 12-month period. They were not considered unemployed because they had not searched for work in 4 weeks preceding the survey. Amongst the marginally attached, 368,000 discouraged workers in July, down 144,000 from a year earlier. Discouraged workers are people not currently looking for work because they believe there is no work to be found. The remaining 1.1 million persons marginally attached to the labor force in July had not searched for work for reasons of academic endeavors or family responsibilities. Onto the establishment survey, non-farm payroll employment increased to 160,000, in line with an average of growth of 6 months, the first 6 months of the year. In 2018, employment gains averaged 233,000 per month. Notably, gains occurred in professional technical services. That was 31,000. Healthcare, 30,000. You can see enormous healthcare is. Social assistance, 20,000. Financial activities at 18,000. Professional and trade services added 31,000 in July, bringing the 12-month job gains to 300,000. In July, employment increased by 11,000 in computer design and related services. This industry accounted for 1/3 of the employment growth in professional technical services, both over the month and over the year. The employment healthcare service rose by 30,000 over the month, reflecting a gain in auditory healthcare. 29,000. Healthcare employment has increased 405,000 over the year, with ambulatory healthcare services accounting for 2/3 of the gain. Social assistance added 20,000 jobs. The industry has increased by 143,000 over the year. Financial activities rose by 18,000, with most of the gains occurring in the insurance carriers and related activity. Mining employment declined by 5,000 July after showing little net change in recent months. Manufacturing changed little, and this demonstrates where the administration's emphasis on manufacturing is going. 16,000 jobs, that job gains in manufacturing averaged 22,000 per month in 2018, down. Employment of major industries, construction, wholesale, retail, trade, transportation, warehousing, information and leisure, hospitality, and government changed little over the month. The average earning for all workers on private non-farm, I'm not sure why they do non-farm payroll, rose 8 cents to $27.98, following an 8-cent gain in June. Over the past year, the average hourly gain has increased 3.2%. In July, the average hourly earning for production and non-supervisory workers rose at 4% to $23.46. The average work week for all workers on private payrolls decreased by 1/10 hour to 34.3 hours in July. In manufacturing, the average work week decreased by 3/10 to 40.4 tenths. Overtime declined by 2/10 to 3.2 hours. The average work week of private sector production workers declined by 1/10 to 33.5. The change in total non-farm employment for me was revised down by 10,000, from 72,000 to 62,000. The change for July was revised down, and this is to be expected this time of the year. In June was revised down by 31,000, from 24,000 to 193,000. With those revisions, employment gains in May and July combined were 41,000. Now this is significant here. 41,000 less than previously reported. Monthly revisions resulted from additional reports received from business and government agencies since the last publication. After revision, job gains averaged 140,000 per month over the last 3 months. Preliminary revisions to establishment survey data to be released on the 21st of August. The establishment survey estimates are benchmarked to comprehensive counts of employment from the quarterly census employment and wage of the month of March. These counts are derived from state unemployment insurance tax records, and nearly all employers are required to file. On the 21st at 10 a.m., the Bureau of Labor Statistics will release the preliminary estimates of the upcoming annual benchmark revision. The final revision will appear, the publication January 2020 employment there. I'll append this. I won't go into the categories here, just looking briefly at this one. Civilian non-institutional population disemployment status at 257,843. That was in July of 2018. In July of 2019, it rose a little bit there. 188 is the change, and this is in thousands. It was 259,225. The civilian labor force was in July of last year at 162,209, and this year it was at 163,351. There, this is in thousand. This would be 163 million actually. Anyway, the change is 37 here. The participation rate in July of last year was 62.9. The participation rate a little better at 63 in July of this year. June it was 62.9, a 1/10 difference there. In May of 2019, it was 62.8. The employed there 155 million in July last year, and 157 million today. An increase in July of 283,000. The employment population ratio in July of last year at 60.5, and in July of this year 60.7, a 1/10 increase there. The number of the number unemployed at 6 million in July of last year, and 0.5 and 6 million, 0.7, went up a little bit there. The unemployment rate 3.9 last year in July, and it is 3.7 this July, 888 there. Not in the labor force. What do we have here? Basically, it was 95, and then in July 633 and 95,874. This time around, that is a negative 8.2. And we keep going down here, and I won't really get into much of this. For teenagers, that's 19 to 16. What have we got here? 3.1 last year, and 12.8 this time around, if I'm looking at that right. For European, 3.3, and it's still 3.3. African Americans is 6.6 in July of last year, and then the 6.2 in May, and is at 6 now. So there's actually they say there's no employment, no change at all there. Well, depending on how they count the change. Anyway, 0.6 temps there is a little different there. If you look at high school graduates, it was 4 at one time, the percentage there, and then 3.5 and 3.6 now in July, so it's dropped a negative 0.3 tenths there. For people with college degrees, 2.2 there was their unemployment rate. Is still 2.2, so it is really never changed. And if we look at this, well, job leaves 835,000 and 833,000 negative 55 are there. Reinsurance, and hadn't looked at that before. Basically, well, a negative 58 there. Duration of unemployment, less than 5 weeks. It was 2 million not 92 last time around, and now it's 2 million 201 and 245. This is less than 5 weeks. We gave that and 27 weeks. This is unemployed. 1,418, and it's 1,414, and 1,000,166. That's a negative 2.48. Persons not in the labor force marginally attached. We gave that number at 1,498 and 1,4978 there. And we gave it for discouraged workers. And what else have we got going here? Oh, by industry. We looked at manufacturing here. Has not performed very well at all. That's basically where we were going. Incidentally, Lowe's is contracting out work, and we'll be making thousands of people unemployed. Some of them will be shifted around in Lowe's and get more people on their sales floor. They'll have less people assembling various items in their warehouse. So there's a lot of things going on here, period. And women and production non-supervisory workers, as percentage there, let's see, 49.7 the last time around. Now it's 49.8 this time around for women, and hourly wages there. And some of the questions, so we'll let it go at that rate there. And let me just fly along here. That was and we'll see what we find here. We'll pull trade up here now. This is from the U.S. Census Bureau, embargoed till the 2nd. International trade in goods and services. This is of June 2019. The Bureau of Economic Analysis announced today that goods and service deficit was at 55.2 billion in June, down 0.3 billion from 55.3 billion in May. Revised, so the deficit here at 55.2 million. Exports at 206.3 billion. That is a negative 2.1% there. And imports at 261.5 billion. That's a negative 1.7 there. Exports for June, 206.3 billion. 4.4 billion less than in May. June's imports were 261.5 billion. That is 4.6 billion less than in May. The June declines in goods and service deficit reflects a decrease in goods deficits of 0.8 billion to 75.1 billion. Decrease in service surplus of 0.6 billion to 20 billion. Year-to-year date, goods and services deficit increased 23.2 billion, or 7.9% from the same period in 2018. Exports increased 5 billion, or less than 1/10%. Imports increased 23.8 billion, or 1.5% there. The 3-month rolling average there, average exports decreased by 1.7 billion to 207.8 billion in June. The average imports decreased by 0.6 billion to 271.7 billion year over year. Annual exports decreased 3.3 billion from June of last year, and average imports increased 4 billion. So this is it. Export of goods decreased at 3.9 billion to 137.1 billion in June. Exports of goods on census basis decreased by 3.8. Consumer goods decreased by 1.9. Gin diamonds decreased by 0.8. Pharmaceutical preparations decreased by 0.5 billion. Jewelry, I hadn't seen this before, decreased by 0.4. Capital goods decreased by 1.2 billion. Computer accessories decreased by 0.4 billion. Other industry equipment and 0.2 billion. Telecommunications equipment decreased by 0.2 billion. Automotive vehicle parts and engines decreased by 0.5 billion. Net balance of payment adjusted decreased by 0.1 billion. Exports of services decreased by 0.5 billion to 69.2 billion in June. Travel for all purposes, including education, decreased by 0.4 billion. Transportation decreased by 0.1 billion. Imports of goods decreased by 4.7 billion to 212.3 billion in June. Import of goods on census basis decreased by 4.4 billion. Industrial supplies and materials decreased by 3.2 billion. Crude oil decreased by 1.4 billion. Other petroleum products decreased by 1 billion. Fuel oil decreased by 0.3 billion there. So the real goods deficit decreased by 0.3 billion to 86.1 billion in June. Real goods in this is 2012 dollars is how we rate things these days. Real imports of goods decreased by 3.1 billion to 234.2 billion. Exports of goods for May were revised up by 0.2 billion. Exports of services were revised down 0.1 billion. Revisions to May, that's exports. Imports of goods revised down less than 0.1 billion. Imports of services were revised down less than 0.1 billion. And this is figures of a surplus with various countries. We have South and Central America 4.8 there in let's see, billions of dollars. In Hong Kong 3.2, Brazil 1.3, the UK 1/10. Deficit recorded in billions of dollars with China 30.2, the EU at 15.9, Mexico very high here 9.2, Japan at 6.2, Germany at 5.2, Canada at 3.3, Italy at 2.6, and France at 1.9, Taiwan at 1.7, India at 1.6, Republic of Korea at 1.4, OPEC at 0.3, Saudi Arabia also at 0.3, and Singapore at 1/10. Deficit with the EU decreased by 1 billion to 15.9 billion in June. Exports decreased by 0.5 billion to 26.7. Imports decreased by 1.5 billion to 42.7 billion. Surplus with Brazil increased 0.8 billion to 1.3 billion in June. Exports increased at 0.3 to 3.9. Imports decreased by 0.5 to 2.6 billion. The balance with Singapore shifted from a surplus of 0.6 billion to a deficit of 1/10 billion. In June, exports decreased by 0.2 to 2.5, and imports 0.4 to 2.6. So these are selected countries here, and where the surpluses were, with these various ones here. Had a surplus of Mexico of 9.2, the EU of 15.9 there. So, and the deficit, of course, decreased there with the EU. And that is the end of this. I'm not sure if we will or will not place this on. We'll see. And let me just give a little philosophical here from Reuters, and we'll switch back over. This is basically what the Reuters headline was. Hiring slows, shorter work week, factory work week. A red flag there. This is on the Lucian Wakwani, I suppose. This is on the second. Tensions between U.S. and China, well, that has moved along. Labor Department's closely watched employment report. And at the same time, the Trump administration announced an additional 10% tariff on $300 billion worth of Chinese imports starting the 1st of September. The central bank cut its short-term rate to its best for 25 basis points. Is easing and erasing an insurance against downside risks, a 10-year-old economic expansion, the longest in history from trade tensions and slowing global growth. Fed officials don't exactly have mud in their eyes after cutting the rate. That's according to Charles Rupke, the chief economist at MUFG in New York. We see nothing in today's report to stop a second rate cut next month. It'd be a mistake. We have always campaigned against the rate cut. Underscoring a moderation in hiring, the average work week fell to its lowest level in 2 years. Hours reduced in other industries combining to work week drop, and we already went over this, 34.4. So-called U.S.-China trade war is taking a toll on manufacturing, with production declining the second quarter there, and the economy during the amortized growth rate of 2.1%, and that is nominal given the global rate, etc. The American First policy is something outdated. We haven't seen this kind of policy since the 20s, before the Great Recession. A depression appeared. So, separate reports, we talked about this, both exports and imports in June showed sharp declines there. So, in other words, nothing is very good here, and we already talked about some inflation on the shot. The 2% target, we've talked about that year over year at 1.6%, and it was a 1.5% gain in May, and the average earnings rose 8 cents in July. Nothing there, and cooling, they say, even with step down employment growth, moderate wage gains. The labor market is supporting the economy as the stimulus from last year, well, it's already faded at $1.5 trillion. The economy is expected to grow at 2.5. That would be modest there in itself. And the labor force participation rate, those who have a job looking for one, rose to 63 there anyway. People are looking, and we gave these figures here. Construction is going nowhere now. In individual parts of the country, construction is doing better. The sector, and this is 12% of the economy, is manufacturing, battered by the problems at Boeing's. The manufacturing work, of course, dropped there with that situation going there. And this is just more of the roundup here. All right, we'll fly along here. From Reuters, there was on the first, Mexico's dependency on U.S. demand spells trouble for a weak economy. I think we'll look at this a little bit because the reason we're doing this, Mexico's gross domestic product increased 0.1% in the April to June period from the prior quarter, narrowly averting a recession. And the president there, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, pledged to rev up the $1.2 trillion economy. That is opposed to a $21 trillion economy. You can see where they are in the U.S. Mexico still sends 80% of its exports to the U.S., and he's trying to reverse that. It takes time. The main stock market in Mexico has dropped 17%. And of course, manufacturing here is at a 3-year low. So we can basically say the administration's policy emphasis on manufacturing has been a failure. Dragged down by mining, construction, energy production, Mexico's industrial output fell 1.6% in the first 5 months of the year versus a year earlier. The only industrial sector bucking the trend was export-oriented manufacturing, which advanced 1%. In dollar terms, exports climbed at 4.2% during the first half of 2019, led by robust demand for goods from automotive and electronics sector. The economy as a whole expanded 0.3% during the first 6 months. The jump came despite threats by DJ Trump, since President Lopez Obrador has stressed making Mexico more sufficient. That has to be done, and it does take some time to do. Anyway, Nemark, that is an auto parts maker that supplies U.S. companies as Ford, GM, etc., generated 56% of its revenue in North America last year. It's now projects an 8% drop in sales. Well, all of this is going to be drops. The automotive goods make up 36% of Mexico's manufacturing export by value, according to the car industry. U.S. consumers absorb 3/4 of Mexico's imports of light vehicles, the biggest component of the sector. The probability of a U.S. recession in the next 12 months reached 32% in July, up from 12%. That's quite a bit there. That's according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. U.S. economy contrasted by 2.5% in 2009, but the Mexican economy shrunk at that time. That was the beginning of the depression at 5.3%. Not bad there. Investor confidence in Mexico has been shaken by some decisions of President Lopez Obrador, including pulling the plug on a partially built 13 billion airport in Mexico City. Retreat from private government, openings of oil and gas to private capital. That was very wise that he did that. The government this week signaled it wants to lift the sluggish economy by a $25 billion stimulus campaign. Anyway, Finance Minister Herrera said on Wednesday that far from slowing the economy would pick up speed in the second half of the year. Well, they would obviously go in that direction here, and let me see where I am here. Oops. I think what we'll do here, we'll come back to the BBC, and we'll have to kind of abbreviate some of this, how the Fed's interest rate helped the Trump war. This is from the Washington Post, and trying to see what's by here. Well, David Lynch. According to Lynch, the Fed Chair Powell may not have wanted to cut the rate, but in the end, DJ Trump gave him no choice. And what they're arguing here is the trade war. The move represented an about face for the Fed, who only last year steered through 4 rate hikes. This is from Powell here, but it's more than Powell. Merely by fulfilling the Fed's traditional role is effectively enabling Trump to pursue a trade strategy to this catastrophic disaster without facing the full consequence at home. Well, Powell in his extreme is an extreme difficult situation. That is from Mike Strand, former researcher at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He doesn't want to compromise the Fed's independence because the president is badgering him to cut rates. At the same time, the trade war is a reality of the U.S. economy. The Fed has to respond to all these realities. 18 months of on and off again tariff threats against you name it, they're out there. U.S. business investment in the second quarter fell 0.6%. Uncertainty caused by the president's American First trade policy, perhaps the greatest threat to the record expansion, was the chief complaint. And these negotiations are going nowhere. And they give an example: BMW, which has a large plant in South Carolina, has no clue about the trade and tariff regimes, auto exports to and imports from the U.S. That's according to Carl Weinberg, the chief international economist at High Frequency Economics, wrote in a client note. We need to get some more client notes out too. And a $21 trillion economy, total tariff effect to date, has been a modest, no doubt about that, unless you're in those sectors. But it is coming home what the markets want to hear from Powell and the Federal Reserve, that it was beginning a lengthy and aggressive rate-cutting cycle that would keep pace with China and the EU. Fred Bernstein, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, said the Fed and its chairman are at a historic juncture. There's no doubt about that. Powell says it's unusual, and this is to the mid-'80s when the Reagan administration responded to persistent trade deficit nowhere where they were now. Reducing the value of the dollar had trade and monetary policy been so closely intertwined. In 1985, an agreement with major trading partners to coordinate actions to drive down the dollar, thus helping American exporters sell more goods. It was the Plaza Accord, named from a New York hotel once owned by old DJ Trump, where the negotiators haggled. The dollar dropped about against the Japanese yen. That was when the Japanese yen mattered, over 50%, although the Fed was reducing interest rates to reinforce the decline. Pressure to speed those interest rate cuts ultimately resulted in, this is the history we were talking about when we came in, an attempted coup against Paul Volcker. He put down the internal rebellion and helped steer the global central banks in managing the dollar's decline. With respect to Fed independence, what matters is how the Fed is perceived. That's according to Mr. Strand. The big question is how this action will affect the perception of Fed independence. Dean Baker, the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, said the erratic nature of the Trump policies is causing problems. We are in really unpredicted territory. Let me just finish up here, and I'll have some comments on this. The underlying factor here is not necessarily the erratic policies of DJ Trump and his administration, but conditions overall of capitalism. Now, this is from Reuters. This is on Greenspan. It's first of this is by Jason Lang here and Sepera. In cutting interest rates, but signaling a series of public cuts was unlikely. The chair, Lawrence Powell, Alan Greenspan used a similar tactic in the 90s with apparent success, rather than marking the start to a lengthy cutting cycle, Powell said in news conference. And we'll save this on Lawrence Powell. We're going to have to separate this out. This is definitely an insurance policy, said Powell, echoing the phrase that Greenspan's Fed used to describe its monetary policy, easing in 95 and 98. Well, we'll see where that goes. Evidently, the two met. Let's see, there's no more frequency. But Greenspan, the two last met sharing a 75-minute lunch. Anyway, I'm not sure who were they sharing lunch with. Oh, Powell, yeah, with former Fed officials. Anyway, in July of 1995, industrial production and job creation were slowing, and new unemployment claims were rising. The Fed policy at the time they cut the rate 3 times in the manufacturing sector. Both regained health. Well, it's totally different nowadays. Just over 3 years later, the economy was showing a few signs of weakness, but the stock, anyway, crunch following the collapse of long-term capital management hedge fund. Again, the Fed cut the rates, but they had room to cut. This is where the situation is a little bit different now. You have 2.5%, and that is the total cut that you have. Let me go to Mr. Carney here, running a little bit over where we want to be. Okay, this is Mark Carney. He's with the warned of instant shock from a no-deal Brexit. He is the governor of the Bank of England, used to be the governor of the Canadian Bank. Items such as petrol and food, gasoline, and would become more expensive if the EU leaves without an agreement. He predicts the value of the pound would fall in response to what he described as a real economic shock. And again, the bank said on Thursday, the bank said that the economy was expected to grow by 1.3% this year, lowering than earlier projections of 1.5%. If the UK leaves the EU, he did not say what he expected to happen in case of a no-deal Brexit. Mr. Carney told the BBC there was a significant possibility that a deal would not be struck, and this is one of the big problems here. It is much more a problem than the circumstances we previously mentioned to you in terms of global economy. Said the bank's response to no-deal Brexit would not be automatic. He explained the bank would have to look at the effects on the economy, such things as car plant closures, as well as the weakening of pound. Now, last month, the Office of Budget Responsibility warned that a no-deal Brexit would deal a $29.3 billion blow to the U.S. economy. Ahead of the referendum, Carney warned the EU would fall into a recession if they vote to leave. At the time, Duncan Smith said the Bank of England governors need to be very cautious about making comments. Well, the situation is those comments are out there, and that is where we are going. Anyway, let me just do the numbers. We'll do the numbers here. We'll have to do this in 2 parts, and we'll return with the comments of Lawrence Powell. The Fed, nonetheless, these are the latest figures. The Fed was down 177.8. This is the Fed 100, and this would be on August the 3rd. In Amsterdam, they were down 18.14. In Paris, down 198.14, and the DAC was down 338.17. The Eurostoxx 500 was down 113.91. In Madrid, they were down 140.6. In Bombay, actually, they had a good day. At 99.90, Hang Seng was down. Many things going on in Hong Kong at 647.12, and the Nikkei was down for 53.83. Now let me just go back up here to the Dow Jones. It was down 98.41 on Friday, and the Nasdaq was down 107.5, and the S&P 500 Chicago 21.51. And these various currencies here. Let's see. The EU currency had 9.48. That's where it stood. And the US dollar had 121.6. Anyway, I believe this is in relation here, yeah. To the pound, I'm assuming here, various currencies here. I don't have where the pound is, and we'll get that later. Brent crude was up $1.39. Brent crude futures, West Texas Intermediate, it used to be called, was up $1.71. It was at $55.66. T-Boom picking is still jumping for joy there. And the Brent crude futures were at $61.89. Nothing there to look home at. The Forex, the gold futures at $29.65. That's what the change was. And it was at $1,436.05. So that is the numbers. That will do it for us this week in economics from our numbers man section of the Bostonred Network. Basically, where we are, the Fed made a political accommodation, whatever they want to call it, is up to them, of 25 basis points. Will that matter in a $21 trillion economy? Well, psychologically to the markets, but the unfortunate problem is the reality is coming home. It's much more than the trade war. You have Lowe's laying off thousands of people, and you'll see more and more across many of these industries. Restaurants are closing, etc. As far as manufacturing basically has been boosted as far as it can go. With or without tariffs, you're going to have the slowdown. If there were no tariffs at all, you would still have a slowdown. China has slowed down because of demand primarily. The tariffs do have some effects, but again, that would be built into the consumers, and consumers are wise enough to understand as those tariffs are put on, they have bought what they need to buy. Now, how it will affect the back-to-school season, we usually talk about that. We don't anymore because we're in August and going into September because of the Amazons of the world, etc. Retailing doesn't get the bump they used to get historically. And also at the same time, when schools return, young workers are usually moved out of that and other workers take their place, but you see these contractions. So in summary, you talk about unusual times. Well, capitalism itself is in a very unusual situation, as we will get some PCIs. We don't have those. We'll throw those in with Chairman Powell's statement there in his press conference. So we'll work a little bit on that, and just the nature of capitalism where they are. The Fed has a limited toolbox. They can cut interest rates. They can increase interest rates, yes. But the tariffs themselves are more psychological. Now, Mexico, a little bit different because of the balance there that Mexico has with the U.S. But the U.S. is also, the consumers are dependent on Mexico in a sense, particularly for vegetables in that area. Auto parts, we'll have to see where the automobile industry is, and that is one of the things we'll look at. But overall, this is just a changing economy, industrial economies. If you start looking at Italy, we didn't look at Italy, but the UK is big on the map. The end of October, they will either leave with a deal or without a deal. In fact, this Tory right-wing government of the Prime Minister Johnson could leave next week if he wished. with or without a deal. The pound has been continuously pounded, if you pardon the pun. So that in itself doesn't bode well there, and some other economies are not doing as well as they should, and we'll look at those when we highlight the chair pile and that situation there, and try to clarify some things. You need to do a little additional research and also look at our seesaw model. Anyway, this is MA at Cranston Analytics, and known as AKI Numbers Man. For those in business, make it a productive next week. For the consumer, obviously the eyes are on the prize, particularly in some parts that you are buying. And we're looking in the smartphone situation to the 5G networks, where Huawei, we had mentioned them, where they stand. They can now buy components. And what will happen there is, if they cannot buy components, I guess it is, but anyway, if they can't buy those, they'll have to find other places to source from or make their own. Now, there's some transition there, but China is transitioning, and they have the consumer base of what would be in people to start to do that. You see they're buying more Huawei phones there, and incidentally, iPhone has fallen. It's no longer the flagship of Apple. They would have you believe they're selling more watches and wearables, which maybe they are, but the markup is not the same. They're getting into the music business also. The Apple music, Apple podcasts, they're out there, but many of us in this sector, internet radio sector, are moving away from Apple. So Apple has a lot of competition. Spotify, which we're on, the Swedish enterprise, they are competing with them. iHeart is claiming to be number one in the internet sector there. They'd be well to do that. So in other words, there are changes taking place in an increasingly changing capitalist environment. Good day.